So, good afternoon. I'm going to start for the second time because I was about to start 15 minutes ago. The previous presenter finished so early that I thought that was the right time. And I also considered to remove our logo here just for consistency. I want to talk about the combination of .NET Core or just .NET and OpenEdge, especially in OpenEdge 12.7. My name is Mike Fechner from Consulting Werk. I'm using OpenEdge for 30 years now, a little over 30 years now. And the proof of that, a couple of weeks ago, we started moving my mother to a new house. And when we were cleaning her old basement, I was picking up a box and opened it to look what's in there. And a training certificate issued by Progress Germany jumped on me, signed by Stefan Bolte. He was called Kischel there at the time. For the Progress colleagues, that might be like funny. The other one is Alfred Elsler. I don't know. You should still know him probably. Anyway, so I work at Consulting Werk in various roles. I'm the director. I work as an architect in modernization projects supporting customers, and I'm responsible for the development of our products like the smart component library and the WinKit. Using Progress or OpenEdge now for quite a while. I like to use the object-oriented features. I've been around long enough that I've done a lot of procedural coding, but if I have a choice, I'd rather do the old stuff. Dealt with various desktop interface technologies and web technologies. And unfortunately, in the last couple of months, last 3 months, one of our web developers was sick, so I actually had to do a lot of Angular coding, and now I know why I hate it. So we at Consulting Werk, we support organizations developing in OpenEdge and related technology. We work out of our main office in Cologne in Germany. We have subsidiaries in the United Kingdom, USA, and Romania, and working with customers, almost all around the world. And we're a vendor of development tools, supporting OpenEdge developers and consulting services. Specialties OpenEdge, integration, architecture, user interfaces, all these kind of things. And that typically leads towards application modernization. We're dealing with quite some other products from Progress Software and third parties. I'm going to leave that like that because I don't want to be blamed for exceeding my time here. So in the next hour, I'm going to talk about, .NET Core, what is .NET Core, a little bit the history of OpenEdge and .NET in general, and then the main topic will be using .NET Core in OpenEdge 12.7. 12.7 was released this May, I think, so 4 months ago. It's a pretty new feature. Then I'm going to talk briefly about this very specific thing which gets quite relevant in the .NET Core world, consuming asynchronous APIs and some benchmarking, comparing the usage of the classic .NET framework and .NET Core in OpenEdge. So when we look at the history of .NET, and I think I say it on the next slide, don't shoot the messenger, it gets a little bit confusing. .NET was started with version 1.0 in the year 2002, and was basically a result of Sun disallowing Microsoft to customize the Java runtime for Windows. Microsoft wanted to add features to the Java runtime. Sun said, hey, you're violating the Java specification, you're not allowed to do that. Then Microsoft said, okay, we have enough developers, we invent our own Java. And that was the birth of the .NET framework and C# as a language. C# pretty much started as a copy of Java as a language. And then over the last 20 years, Microsoft kept on releasing new versions of the .NET framework. .NET 2.0 was pretty much where the mainstream development began. There were some breaking features from .NET 1.0 to 2.0. But after that, .NET was pretty much backwards compatible. There were some initiatives in the .NET Framework world that didn't take off the ground as much as Microsoft was hoping for. The Windows Communication Foundation or the Windows Workflow Foundation probably haven't been used as much as Microsoft was hoping for as framework components. WPF, Windows Presentation Foundation, is an alternative UI technology in the .NET world. We're using in the progress world typically the WinForms UI that was released with .NET 1.0. In 2009, the .NET Framework was released, and that was then a much bigger change than 3.0 because a new version of the Common Language Runtime. The Common Language Runtime is a .NET runtime. It's like the JVM for Java or the AVM for OpenEdge. And 2019, Microsoft released .NET Framework 4.8, and 4.8 is going to be the final version of the .NET Framework. But just like Windows 10 was going to be the last version of Windows, who knows how that's says. So the .NET Framework is supposed to be feature stable now with version 4.81, or I think there's a 4.82 announced. So no new features to the .NET Framework. And for 20 years, you could use the term .NET Framework and .NET interchangeably. But now you have to be careful. The .NET Framework is not .NET, and .NET is not the .NET Framework. That are two different frameworks. Not my choice. I don't know who messed it up as Microsoft. Microsoft used in the early days of .NET for everything. Suddenly everything was .NET. Microsoft Office was .NET. The servers were .NET. Everything became .NET. It was like a big marketing term for everything. But now we have to be careful. What we've been also using as OpenEdge developers for the last 15, 16 years is .NET Framework, not .NET. We start using .NET with version 12.7 in OpenEdge. So .NET is now the new family of frameworks. And it started in 2014 as the cloud-optimized .NET framework. Around that time, Microsoft has also acquired a company that was using .NET ports on mobile devices like iPhones and Androids, Xamarin. And with Xamarin, Microsoft started to make .NET also platform independent. The first release candidate, the first version around that time, was called .NET Core 5.0. And still a lot of developers refer to it as .NET Core, even though Microsoft isn't using that as the product name now anymore. .NET Core 5.0 was a release candidate name, and the first version of that .NET Core got a version number 1.0. And Microsoft said, well, we are accepting breaking changes there. Not many. It's not that every .NET application has to be completely rewritten, but enough so that you should be careful with loading your code into a .NET Core development environment and promising your customer that after a compile and go, it will work. So then there may be some breaking changes. Then later .NET, the core was dropped from the name, and it became .NET 5.0 again. Now there's a version 6.0, there was a version 6.0 where there was a big emphasis on performance improvements, and there are further performance improvements in .NET 7.0. So Microsoft has blog articles where they publish their performance comparisons between .NET Framework 4.8 and .NET Core 6 and 7, and the numbers are massive. I'll have some of those on the slides later. And together with all that, .NET became open source as well as platform independent. So everybody can download the source code of the .NET Framework. Microsoft is not the closed source company of everything anymore. So almost annual releases. With OpenEdge, we'll be looking at .NET 6 right now, because that was when Progress was working on the integration with 12.7. .NET 7 just was a little bit too late for that, obviously. Well, the .NET community is now looking towards .NET version 8. And still, Microsoft doesn't use the term .NET Core anymore. I'm pretty sure if you Google for it, you will find even Microsoft blog articles that still refer to it as .NET Core. In the community, if you Google for articles, really use core, .NET Core, then you find the articles for the new version of .NET. If you just Google for .NET, you have to look careful if it's applying to the 4.8 and previous frameworks or for .NET 6 and up. Even Progress, when they started integration, the startup parameter that tells the Progress runtime to use the .NET 6 and up frameworks is called -CLR net core. So Progress could have named it -CLR not net 6 or 7 or whatever, just net, but no, they also stick to the core. Well, habits of developers do not always follow the marketing. So what are some of the aspects? So it is platform independent. So you can use large parts of the .NET Core framework, of .NET Core, on Windows, on Macs, on Linux, on ARM machines, and it is open source, released under an MIT Apache 2 license. So there's a GitHub page where it's all maintained. It's focusing on C# and F# as a language. There's just limited support for VB.NET. Tooling, it's available in Visual Studio Code, or command line tools. And it's like with a lot of the web development tooling these days, a command line interface for build and templating, etc., is very, very key to tooling these days. There's some limitations, some features that were dropped, even though .NET Core on Linux, one of the use cases being used for .NET on web servers, but not all of the various templating systems around the .NET framework have been ported to .NET Core. So ASP, the web forms, for instance, isn't there, but there are other methods to build web user interfaces using .NET Core. The Windows Workflow Foundation has been dropped. The Communication Foundation has been dropped. And there's only limited support for Windows. .NET Core offers graphical user interfaces on Windows PCs only. There's no graphical user interface in the .NET Core world on Linux machines or Mac machines, unless you use some of the more webby dialects like Maui, etc. But we cannot just create a WinForms UI on Windows and expect that now with a platform-independent .NET, it suddenly runs on a Mac. That's not working. Microsoft has dropped a few of the WinForms controls. The data view has been dropped in favor of the data grid view. The data view has been introduced in the first version of .NET 1.0, and with version 2.0, there was a new grid control, data grid view, and Microsoft has now kicked the deprecated control out of the box. They did that also for some of the toolbar and menu controls. But they aren't really heavily used. So for many GUIs, it will be load and go, as long as the third-party controls that you may be using are supported on .NET Core as well. So there are blog articles outlining the removed controls. Why I'm mentioning this here is, as an ABL developer, we might have, starting 10.2a, started using some of those controls. If an ABL developer has used the data view as a data grid in an OpenEdge application and he wants to port that now to .NET Core, he will also have to upgrade the grid to a newer version. Recommendation was since long time not to do that. .NET Core comes with a lot of tooling for web developers. It comes with an integrated web server, pretty much like most of the other web development frameworks do as well. Containerization is easy, either using Windows containers or Docker. yeah, the .NET 4.8 framework is feature frozen, so we should not expect new features there. And yeah, there are various other new UI technologies, Blazor, WebAssembly. Nick is there. He's been talking about that this morning, I believe. There's a packet manager. I'm still not quite sure whether that's a good or a bad thing. NuGet, similar to NPM for web application developers. And that's the way how you're supposed to download third-party components into your development environment. And I hope that in the near future we can do that in OpenEdge too. I will show you that now. That's a little bit more complicated because the tooling support that Progress has with 12.7 is still limited there. So how did .NET and OpenEdge work together in the past? So if you remember, the .NET framework started in 2002. Microsoft had the first integration with .NET in 2003. I think that's pretty fast, especially for OpenEdge timescales. The .NET Open Client was released, allowing a .NET developer using Visual Studio to build applications to use the Open Client to connect to the classic OpenEdge app server at that time. And then in 2007 or 18, OpenEdge 10.2a was released, and there Progress released OpenEdge GUI for .NET, which was the ability to use .NET WinForms UI controls in the OpenEdge GUI client. So an OpenEdge GUI client suddenly didn't have to use the grayish Progress out-of-the-box controls. You could use everything the .NET market had to offer in terms of UI controls. In the next release, 10.2b, OpenEdge has officially opened the bridge technology, which is a technology that integrates the .NET runtime into the OpenEdge client for the use of non-GUI use cases. There was a pretty strict sentence in the license, in the end-user license agreement for OpenEdge 10.2a, which said that non-GUI use of the .NET bridge was not only not supported, it was disallowed. Whatever that means legally. If Progress could have sent lawyers after us if we would have used that. And that was mainly because Progress wanted to be sure that if anything breaks with different use cases that they haven't tested, we don't flood tech support with support calls and lawyers. Well, so that was 10.2b, and then in 2011, Progress with OpenEdge 11 started integrating the .NET 4 runtimes, the CLR 4.0 for GUI for .NET, and dropped CLR 2.0. The .NET runtimes themselves, they're not just backwards compatible. The language typically is backwards compatible, but not the runtime itself, and so it just didn't make any sense to support the two different runtimes. So now, 12 years later, and it looks a little bit like 12 years, not a lot has happened in the .NET support. Progress offers us optionally the use of the .NET 6 runtime, but the .NET 4.8 framework runtime is still the default runtime. So it's now a new option. But you have to choose. You use one or the other. You cannot use the .NET 6 runtime for some components and the 4.8 framework runtime for other components. You have to choose. There was something in between, but that didn't fit on the screen. In 12.4, Progress supported the use of .NET Client with .NET, I think at the time it was .NET 5 Core. Progress has two packages of UI controls that traditionally a lot of OpenEdge developers have been using when using .NET controls. In 2007, when they started with version 10.2a, started the support for .NET, Progress started a cooperation with one of the larger, if not the largest, vendor of .NET components, and that was a company called, or is a company called Infogistics. And the cooperation there for us is visible that we can purchase the infagistic controls through Progress software. And if we do that, we get technical support for the controls through Progress software. That means if I have a problem with using the infagistic controls in the context of the OpenEdge GUI client, I have one tech support organization that I need to talk to and not two. And infagistic tells us, oh, I never heard of OpenEdge, talk to OpenEdge support. And they say, no, it's an infagistics problem, and I'm the man in the middle. So if I buy the controls via Progress software, then the Progress tech support has to support them fully. And Progress used the controls a lot in documentation and QA. So there are lots of samples in the knowledge base for using infagistic controls, using the infagistics grid or whatsoever. 2014, Progress has acquired Telerik. Telerik is also a vendor of UI technology. The main reason why Progress has acquired Telerik was their web technology, Candy UI, Sitefinity, and so. But then they looked in the box, oops, they're also .NET controls, so let's see what we're going to do with them. The support for the Telerik Red controls, that's the name of their .NET control suite, was a little bit bumpy in the beginning, and I think there's still some issues which haven't been fixed. So for me, I still prefer to use infagistics controls. I have just 7 more years of experience with them. I started using them in 2007, and I'm old habits die hard. But I just also know that they work so much better than the Telerik controls. So, what are the components of GUI for .NET? The .NET runtime is loaded into the OpenEdge GUI clients. So the Progress runtime, the AVM, and I think at that time the term AVM for ABL virtual machine was coined for the first time. At least I didn't hear it any earlier. AVM in contrast to the JVM for Java virtual machine, and the .NET common language runtime, they are loaded into the same Progress. So the ProWin 32 for the 32-bit client, or ProWin or ProWC for the web client processes, they always hold the ABL runtime. I mean, that's the main purpose. But they then load the .NET runtime into the same process. And then there's in-process communication between the two runtimes. And that allows an ABL developer to create instances of .NET classes, .NET types, set their properties, invoke methods, and subscribe to events. There's data binding support. The data binding is one of the features that wasn't possible with ActiveX controls, for instance. So Progress has done many things much better in the support of .NET in the ABL than they did with ActiveX controls. It's much more stable. The Progress language was much further developed. Progress could base a lot of the support on the object-oriented language features that have been integrated into the language at the same time. So it's a much better package. So, .NET exceptions are integrated into .NET error handling. And how it looks, you can just define a variable of a .NET type anywhere in your program. And if you wouldn't know that System Windows Forms form is a .NET type, you could see it as an ABL type, you wouldn't see the difference. So that's how well it's integrated on the language level. There's a lot of tooling support. There's a Visual Designer that allows us to draw UIs, code completion with Progress Developer Studio out of the box, or even better with OEDT. Lars was here. There's Lars. OEDT does it much better, like many things are much better in OEDT. VS Code through Riverside Language Server offers code completion for .NET classes too. Developer Studio is a class browser that lets us scan the classes which are there and their properties and methods, etc. And there's a tool to manage the assembly references in the assembly XML file. So now let's look for the new stuff. So starting 12.7, OpenEdge supports .NET 6.0 as an alternative to the .NET framework. Alternative means when you start a session, you have to decide whether you started with support for the .NET framework or .NET 6. So it's not like at installation time. It's when you start a Progress session. And And it is there in all Progress runtimes on Windows. So by default, it uses 4.8, and using the -CLR net core startup parameter, it uses .NET 6.0 instead. And you cannot use them in parallel. So links to documentation. If you want to use .NET 6 with OpenEdge, you have to install the .NET 6 runtime or the SDK yourself. You get that from the Microsoft installers. Unlike the .NET framework, .NET 6 is not by default installed on Windows, also not on Windows 11. You have to install it yourself. There's a Windows package manager, which I also just recently learned about, winget install --id equals .NET SDK 0.6 or .NET desktop runtime .6. That's the way how you install the .NET runtime. So that's a prerequisite to using .NET Core, .NET 6. And on previous versions of Windows, where .NET 4.8 was not automatically installed, like Windows 10, Windows 11, you always had a .NET framework. You had to have a .NET framework installed in order to install OpenEdge. There's no such limitation in the installer for .NET Core. And I think especially in 12.7, where it is probably just for people experimenting with it. We'll soon see why it's probably not yet ready for prime time. It makes a lot of sense that it's an optional feature and that doesn't add any additional burden on people that are installing OpenEdge anywhere. So startup parameters related to the support for .NET Core, -CLR net core, use .NET Core instead of .NET Framework. And the others two, preload CLR and -assemblies, that existed for the support for .NET Framework already. So a lot of developers that have been using GUI for .NET knew about the -assemblies folder. The -preload CLR startup parameter was probably known a little less. If you're not using preload CLR, what happens is the Progress runtime will load the .NET framework when it's needed the first time. And that may be bad for startup performance of an application. Because if you're using preload CLR, the Progress client may start loading the .NET runtime into the Progress client in parallel to other initialization tasks, maybe like waiting for connecting to a database or so. And if you load it because you need it, then the OpenEdge hits in an R code the first instruction that needs to use a .NET class, and then it says, okay, now I need to load the .NET framework, which could cause a delay then. So there are not many things being multi-threaded in the Progress client, but with -preload CLR, the loading of the .NET framework can be multi-threaded, happening in a background thread. Assembly management is significantly different in .NET Core than it was in the .NET Framework. First thing, there's no global assembly cache anymore. In .NET Framework, the global assembly cache was a folder with some subfolders where the Windows operation system centrally managed assemblies. And then the same version of an assembly is a DLL file, could be used by multiple applications and could also be used in memory by multiple applications. So in theory, that sounds like a memory optimization or generally something more efficient. In reality, managing assemblies in the global assembly cache wasn't always that nicely. The assemblies may be locked there. You have to be careful with versions there and stuff like that. That's something that isn't there by Microsoft. So in the .NET Core framework, we always have assemblies within the application folder. I'll show that very soon, how that looks like. The result of that, since we only have one DLL in that folder, there is no need to specify the assembly versions. In the .NET Framework, support for assembly, so assembly version was very critical. You had to reference the right assembly version, otherwise Progress wasn't able to load it. So that's actually a little bit easier. There's no private probing path. The private probing path is something that wasn't really documented by Progress in the beginning, but now there are even mentions of it in the knowledge base. We started to use the probing path pretty early when we started using .NET components that allowed us to use multiple subdirectories for storing assemblies, and so we kept them by vendor or by type of that. That is not currently supported by Progress to use something like a private probing path there. We'll see what may change there in future versions. Getting assemblies into an OpenEdge project for .NET Core currently is a little bit complicated. You have to get hold of the assemblies. And if you get hold of, for instance, a package like Infragistics controls, Infragistics has .NET Core versions too, either using Nugget or download and a zip file, you'll have them a folder with many subfolders for all the different supported .NET Core versions. And you have to pick the right ones and all their dependencies and copy them manually into your OpenEdge folder. That is painful right now and usually requires a bit try and error. Progress doesn't support Nugget yet. There's an OpenEdge idea, and if you sound like that's useful, you should vote for that idea. It was created by one of the OpenEdge developers, Matt Baker, but he also needs our votes to get this feature rated up for product management. What I usually do is I create a Visual Studio project with the same assemblies that I need, because when I then build it, it copies me all the DLLs that are needed into one folder, and then I take the content of that one folder and copy that over to my OpenEdge install. So tooling is still a bit, even if we're using the same classes, so most of the classes are there for .NET Framework 4.8 and .NET 6. Same methods, same properties, same everything, most of them. We need to recompile the application. The compiler checks, the Progress compiler checks during compilation the exact versions of the assemblies that we're using. And the versions are typically different. So that's why we need to recompile. So that means we need to use the -CLR.NET Core startup parameter at compile time and at runtime, because we need to reference the same framework. And we can see that when you look at a Progress procedure that references the .NET framework, near the end of the R code, so you should use a text editor that doesn't completely get mad when it looks at a binary file, then you see the .NET assemblies that are referenced near the end of the R code. And there you see here, it's referencing the system private core lib, and that sounds like .NET Core, in version 6.0. And that's just different than a system.whatever from the classic .NET framework. So it is burned into the R code. So tooling support. No. Nothing yet. So right now we only have a runtime and compiler support. All the tooling that made GUI for .NET easy to use for OpenEdge developers, starting with the Visual Designer, and I'll show you the Visual Designer in a second, code completion in Developer Studio, the class browser, support to maintain the assemblies file is not yet there. I'm expecting marginal improvements in 12.8. I would be surprised to see the Visual Designer working in 12.8. I didn't say it's not going to be there, I just said my opinion that I would be surprised. If you want code completion today for .NET Core, you have to use Riverside's language server for Visual Studio Code. There it's working already. The good thing is the differences for us as a programmer when we write code between .NET Framework 4.8 and .NET Core 6.0 are very marginal. Most of the code will just work. So we can use 4.8 to develop with all the support implemented over the last 15, 16 years with .NET Framework 4.8 and execute or compile and execute it on .NET 6. So Progress didn't even have time to implement proper error handling when I tried to use a Visual Designer. If I tried to start the Visual Designer in a Developer Studio project with support for the CLR.NET Core, the .NET 6.0 runtime, you get this error message, and guess where you find it? Behind Developer Studio. So you have to hear the beep, or boing, bing, and then look behind Developer Studio to find that error message. Microsoft, the Visual Designer, was one of the big changes on the tooling side in the .NET implementation from Microsoft itself. There was even a long debate within Microsoft, and that was held in GitHub threads, because that's where the development of the .NET framework is done, of .NET Core is done. There were many people in Microsoft said it's not worth to provide for the WinForms UI, which for the view of many Microsoft developers is old UI technology, 20-year-old UI technology. There were many people that said it's not worth to provide a Visual Designer for that. But the other side has won, so there's no new Visual Designer, but the new implementation, the startup process for the designer is different, which has functional benefits. The new .NET Designer that you could use in the Microsoft Visual Studio now supports what you see is what you get preview that supports the styling of the OS. So in the Visual Designer, your screens don't look like you're developing for Windows 7. They will look like you're developing for Windows 11, for what it's worth. But that are changes. I'm expecting that Progress will address that in the future, but not in the next couple of weeks, I guess. So, but what you can do is you can use the .NET Framework Designer, so using the classic framework 4.8, draw a UI there, and copy the source code into a project that's enabled for the 6.0 runtime, compile it there, and execute it there. And that's what I did there. And we have a simple UI with a button, and I'll show you now a little bit more fancy UI. Also not the most fanciest UI you've probably ever seen. Making use of that. So in this Developer Studio workspace, I have multiple projects. I have one, the name suggested, is using the CLR.NET Core startup parameter. And I have another project which simply isn't using that startup parameter. You won't find it there, and you won't find it in any other assembly. So, and which is the folder? It's in the test folder. So I can take simple infographics form, that's the one I want to use. Open that in the Visual Designer here. Visual Designer running here in the .NET 4.8 framework that would have been supported in 12.6, 12.5, back to 10.2 of OpenEdge. Okay, well, that happens when you hibernate your laptop. Sorry for that. Restarting Developer Studio quickly. Whatever quickly means for Developer Studio. So I have an inflogistics ribbon here, not a lot in it yet. I'm going to change that now. And I can add some other controls there. Just going to add a simple button here. Put into the grid, next to the grid. Change the size of the grid. And so I can now run it from here, run it in the 4.8 framework, like that. Some resizing here, well, buttons, no code behind that. So now I take this wonderful piece of source code, look into that. That defines all the components as variables, and there's the button that I just added. And if you look for the button in the source code, it's defined there with the text and whatever. I can change the text using the Visual Designer. And I could add a trigger to it or an event handler to it. Run it again. And it works, and I can see a stack trace that looks like a progress stack trace, but it's still all coming out of the 4.8 version of the frameworks. So now I take this file and its best friends, the resource file, and I copy them into this project, and I'm copy them over the version that's already there. So if I try to open that from here, you heard it beep. It cannot find the Visual Designer loader because that's just not there in the .NET 6 implementation of Progress. So I'm gonna close that and open the source code. Restart the runtime. May even have to start Developer Studio. Let me see if it compiles. No, it's responsive for compiling. So, and now I can run that in the .NET 6 runtime. So I see a trial copy banner because I'm using a trial version of the inflogistics controls here, but the button is working, etc. And I can write code if I know what I need to write. And if you have 17 years of routine with writing GUI for .NET, that's not gonna difficult. So I'm gonna write a query. So the compiler knows whether that is valid or not. So if I mistype the property name, I get a compile time error. And I can run it. And I see now the data of the sales rep table there. So it is just like GUI for .NET without any tooling support. So we just have the compiler and the runtime. Good. Did I close PowerPoint? So now we could wonder, why are we using this if it's not yet ready? Well, or where are we with this? So what we are typically using to design application screens is our own Visual Designer that we've built based on the .NET Visual Designer. So an application developer using our framework typically doesn't use the Visual Designer anymore. CCE, you started too early from that aspect. You're using that not yet, but since a couple of years, that's our standard Visual Designer. And we're in the process of porting that to .NET Core. So we're probably doing the same work that Progress is doing right now. So when we're there, then we could be using for developer runtime in our framework, the .NET Core runtime. Right now, we have an early version of supporting our framework runtime using .NET Core because we haven't yet been able to update all of our own assemblies or third-party assemblies to .NET Core. I expect that we're done with that by the end of the year. It's going to be a bit of work for us. That's our own Visual Designer running within a Progress GUI application. You can move around controls and see that. And there we will not see any difference. The functionality of the new Visual Designer is the same. It's just the loading of it will be different. So that's a phased development that we're in the middle in. For the OpenEdge Ultra controls, Progress has made a decision to drop the support for the OpenEdge Ultra controls for .NET Core. So you cannot obtain the .NET Core variants of the infinite controls through Progress anymore, which means you will also not get the technical support through Progress anymore. Did you have a question? No. So we need to be obtaining them from Infogistics directly. A pure assumption from me is that the reselling of the Infogistic controls for Progress was just a lot of administrative work and no revenue that made up for that. So I guess that was not a profit for Progress. And now they've seen a technical reason to stop that cooperation. That's just my assumption. So we need to obtain the license, the components through Infogistics directly. Then we can get them as zip files or installed via the NuGet package manager. The most significant difference that we will see as a developer when we maintain the assemblies file, previously Infogistics always had the version number of their controls, which is part of that is a year in which they were released as part of the DLL file names. And we had to reference them that way. Infogistics has dropped that. So Infogistics now has a constant name for the assemblies that's version independent. So they dropped the v22.1 from there. But still a version that comes with that. So when we started looking at porting our framework or application to .NET Core, well, we had to look at all the third-party .NET components that we had been using. So for some it was a quick check. The OpenEdge Ultra controls, they are available as .NET Core through Infogistics. The Telerik RUT controls are available through Telerik as .NET Core versions. Ceph Sharp, which is the .NET port of the Google Chrome browser, which we use as a browser in applications, that is available as a .NET Core port. We used various other Microsoft assemblies. They are typically all available as .NET Core. We have a third-party ERD designer where we can draw like tables and relations between tables in one of our tools. We're maintaining the source code of that ourselves. So we're porting that to .NET Core. The biggest or the most exciting part for us was ProParse. For those of you who know ProParse, it's a code parser that translates AVL source code into a hierarchical structure that's easier to analyze for tooling. ProParse is a Java tool, and we used it in OpenEdge through a .NET Java runtime or Java runtime as part of the .NET framework called IKVM. And the IKVM, the open source project, was dormant for a couple of years, 6 or 7 years. Not a lot happened there anymore. But last year, IKVM woke up again. And one of the first things they did is they released .NET Core support for IKVM. So based on that, we can support ProParse also in .NET Core. So why are we doing that if Progress is not yet ready? Well, it is for us the chance to use the latest version of the .NET framework. We're not expecting new features from Microsoft for the 4.8 frameworks, and we're not expecting, similar to the slow death of all the ActiveX controls, because no vendor just kept on adding new features to ActiveX controls anymore. Progress still supports them today, but if the vendors don't create new ones, that's like a death for it. I'm expecting that something like that will happen sooner or later in the .NET world too, that the .NET 4.8, no control vendor will be adding new features for that in the foreseeable future. Already today we see that many new APIs are available either as .NET Core first or not even available for the classic framework at all. .NET Core is faster, I'll get into that later. And well, there's an OpenEdge idea. So Progress, this idea portal that had an idea there since 2019, asking for .NET Core support on Linux. And earlier this year, that idea went into Progress. And for those that were in Rob Straight's roadmap session or 12.8 session today, it mentions support for .NET 6 on Windows and Linux. So for those who are seeking for extensions to the ABL on PassOE, on Linux, or within a Docker container, .NET Core is a great opportunity. Well then, if we have to deal with .NET Core on the app server, I'll show you a very simple example soon, just to use some trigonometrical functions. We have been waiting for square roots and sinus and cosinus in the ABL for 40 years now. In the .NET framework, .NET Core, it is just there. And a lot of applications have to calculate, I don't know how many small boxes fit into bigger boxes. And sooner or later, you need some trigonometry there, or how much packing material you need, or whatever. That and many other APIs will make our life much easier when we are able to use .NET Core also on the app server. So I have an example here to use some trigonometry, calculating the distance on the globe, using there the distance between our office in Cologne and the Progress headquarters in Burlington, assuming the world is a perfect sphere and not a whatever eggish shape. Then we need sinus, cosinus, tangents, square root, etc. And pi as a constant. Okay, well, it's a constant, but something we could have in the ABL too. But and .NET had these things since the beginning, just as a very simple example. So, and then we can see code like this. Well, I'm using the var statement here, which is available 12.4, 12.5. I don't know, to define variables, but I could also just say define variable dlon as decimal, no undo. Initializing it with a method call here. So here I'm referencing to the system.mask pi constant. We have tangents and sinus and cosinus there, and it just appears as it has always been part of the ABL. As a Progress GUI developer, I could have been using this for the last 17 years, but never on the app server. And typically, we would want to use calculations, etc., on the app server. So now we can use, in a couple of weeks, months, we can use that on the app server too. So the result of that function seems to be right, 5,750 kilometers between Cologne and Burlington. So that is the main benefit, being able to use that in the next version on the app server and have the same .NET version on the app server and the front end. But there's some others. A lot of the performance improvements in the .NET, or there are two sources or two ways Microsoft improves the performance in .NET Core. One is they just improved their code or simplified their code. The other is making much more use of asynchronicity. Asynchronous calls, asynchronous APIs in .NET does not mean multi-threading. Just you're running something that uses idle cycles of your program within the same thread, but doing multiple things in parallel. And one example there, if you want to do an HTTP request from a .NET application, then you will see there was an old version called Web Client in the .NET framework that Microsoft considers now being deprecated. And Microsoft then points you to the system.NET HTTP client class, a new implementation of it. And if you look at that, it only has methods that have the term async in that are asynchronous methods. And consuming them from the ABL requires a little bit understanding of the asynchronous concept in .NET. In .NET, you would just use the await keyword that says run this and wait for completion. It's like a wait for an ABL. And then you process the result. And while you're waiting for that, the runtime could be doing something different in parallel. It's syntactical sugar, and the AVM wait, or the .NET runtime waits for the completion of the asynchronous operation then. Similar concept like promises or such in web frameworks. We don't have an await keyword in the ABL. And I'm not expecting one in 12.8 either. But we can handle asynchronous operations. So that's now an ABL sample where I use an asynchronous operation. So I call into the getStream async and to download a file. And what I need to do is I need to run a loop waiting for the completion of the task, and I have to do a pause in between. A pause statement is a cheap way of waiting. A pause does not consume CPU time, and thanks to Tom Bascom, Progress now supports sub-second pauses. So pause 0.1 is a good use case for that. Could also do a pause 0.01 or so, but then the ABL loop is probably getting too heavy. And checking for the completion of that run, and that's how we can use asynchronous APIs. And many APIs in the .NET Core world are asynchronously. So a little bit on benchmarking. Microsoft says there are huge performance improvements in various areas. That's a block, that's the entry point to the official there. And one simple sample is the parsing of a GUID. And when consuming web services and whatever, parsing GUIDs from a string representation into the actual .NET type for that is something that happens quite often. So it's quite a central operation. So Microsoft documents huge improvements. And what I wanted to check is how much do we benefit from that. So that's the improvements that Microsoft says. They're saying with .NET 6, a 6 times improvement. 0.13 is roughly 6 times improvement. So doing a test in ABL, comparing 4.8 framework in 12.7 to 6.0 core framework, doing it 500,000 times, because it's not that slow that it takes much more. And I see a timing difference, 5 seconds versus 6 seconds. So it's a 20%, it's not 6 times, 20%, still significant. But I mean, we have the overhead of an ABL loop. Each time I pass the string representation of a GUI to the .NET framework, the string gets converted from an ABL character into a .NET string before there it's converted into GUI. So it's happening just more. But still, we see a performance improvement. I do not need a single second more. So there's some improvement, but not that much. So, and for my distance calculation, which uses multiple .NET APIs, so I'm running that once with the CLR.NET Core and one without. There, we're actually seeing 2.4 seconds versus 1.9. That's also something. I mean, it's not 6 times faster, but when you're looking to improve stuff, then everything counts. For GUIs, starting GUIs, I haven't benchmarked that yet, but my gut feeling says that when you're launching a complex GUI, it is also a little bit faster. But that could be wishful thinking, so I need to do some benchmarking there, but yeah. Hey, Christy ran away. No, there she is. Good. So I'll take questions in the break, I guess. Thanks for your time, and see you later.